Welcome back, Call Time viewers. Thank you so much for your support and viewership. It's meant so much to me. I know I say this every week, but hopefully it'll never get old. After this special episode, you should look forward to some really incredible guests in this next round. I'm so excited, and also possibly some new exciting developments down the line. But for now, we are all here for my third special episode and historic moment in the Call Time annals, because I'm going to be going deep into a play. Those of you who are loyal, longtime Call Time viewers may have already figured out that my soft spot lies with musical theater, but I figured after all this time, it would be nice to give straight theater a fair shake. So I will be discussing today the incredible play, The Heidi Chronicles. Now, this may seem like an odd choice for the first play that I interrogate. You know, it's no Shakespeare, it's no Sophocles, it's no Ibsen, and for that matter, it's no great classic American drama a la Long Day's Journey into Night. But my attitude to the special episodes has never been, you know, Katie and her friends take you through the objectively greatest plays and musicals to have graced the Broadway stage. It's more like, why do we think about these shows, even though they may not be as objectively great as an Antigone, as a Midsummer Night's Dream, as A Doll's House? But why have they entered our DNA, our consciousness, in a similar way to those great plays? So, a little background on the Heidi Chronicles. It's a 1988 play by Wendy Wasserstein that was developed at Seattle Rep and Playwrights Horizons before moving to Broadway. It featured now very famous actors like Joan Allen, Boyd Gaines, Sarah Jessica Parker, Cynthia Nixon, Peter Friedman, Tony Shalhoub, and went on to win 2 Dramatists, 2 Tony Awards for Best Actor in a Play and Best New Musical, and of course the Pulitzer Prize in Drama. Most importantly, it seemed to capture the zeitgeist of the late 80s, early 90s, and undoubtedly marked a turning point for the way women were represented on stage. In fact, I would argue that this play changed the culture. I know that's a big statement, but as an example, I was doing research on the play, and I discovered that the initial title for the show Seinfeld, also one of my obsessions in life, was the Seinfeld Chronicles, as a deliberate callback to the play, which clearly by that point had become so ubiquitous. It's important I mention that because I think it's rare that a play or musical leaps or manages to leap out of the cordoned off theatrical world that those of us in theater exist in. You know, we're doing it all the time, so it may be hard for us to remember that the average person may not know a lot about title of show. If anything, I think you would be hard pressed to find people beyond theater who know much about it. But the Heidi Chronicles, because of some special different reasons, which we will discuss later, was able to make that leap. However, we should acknowledge that looking at the Heidi Chronicles now, there's no doubt that it lacks necessary intersectionality. The women that it represented were privileged, white, largely Jewish women living in New York City. And that's a tough fact that we have to confront when working with Wasserstein's canon, because they all sort of deal with these same types of women. On the other hand, it really was the first time that women were center stage in the American theater, and it wasn't about romance. It asked questions about, you know, she was sort of the first to ask, can women have it all, which we will be discussing in great detail later. But also what drew me to her, which has been a huge focus of mine academically, is the relationships between women, not necessarily romantic relationships between women, but friendship and family and all the thorny stuff in between, you know, envy, competition. I think before the Heidi Chronicles, it was easy to represent relationships between women on 2 extremes as either sort of competitive shrews or angelic friends that always got along. And something Wasserstein really understood, and which I will discuss more in depth, is that there can be a lot in between in that gray area. And that's where the really juicy stuff is. And so in that way, I think we can draw a clear line from the Heidi Chronicles to shows like Sex and the City and Girls, who also have their own problems with a lack of intersectionality. But then following on to shows like Broad City, Insecure, and even I May Destroy You, I think I would wager that you can draw a clear line from Wendy Wasserstein and the Heidi Chronicles to I May Destroy You and Michaela Cole. So hopefully that is intriguing to you, because we will be discussing all of the good things about Heidi Chronicles, all of the not so good things, and more with one of my favorite people on the planet, an incredible woman and playwright, Maya Macdonald, and a dear friend. Well, welcome to the show, Maya Macdonald, the wonderful playwright and friend. I'm thrilled to have you. Thanks for being here. Would you like to introduce yourself to our viewers and describe a bit about what you do and who you are?
I'm Maya Macdonald. I'm a playwright and other sorts of write. I write a lot about femininity, which is probably why you've picked me to talk about this play.
Well, you're absolutely right that that's a big reason, in addition to the fact that I like you and we're friends, but that's a big reason why I wanted to have you on to talk about this play, because I've known you and your work since you were in grad school. I definitely think of you as sort of a continuation of what Wendy started. Like, now, what kinds of questions do we have now in the 21st century about femininity? And I'm very drawn to that. And so I thought that would be a great way to start. But you already started us off pretty well. So I want to ask you, are you a fan of Wendy Wasserstein?
Reading her plays is expanded for me based on what I know about who she was as a person. And that was sort of one of the reasons I think why she was like recommended to me when I was, in fact, I think the last time I read this play must have been 2003, because I still have like pencil notes from when I was reading it last. I think I've both, well, there are aspects of her style that I haven't been drawn to, but I think we see a lot of like the sort of first season of Sex and the City. I remember being like, well, the way the direct address was used was like very Wendy. But I think that there's something that like deeply separates her from that representation in a lot of ways. I think there's, a sense of hope in her. Like I think my work, I'm much more interested in the internal lives of women and female represented, characters, and in what we can't say, what we don't have words for. And I think Wendy's work is very much about, her characters are defined by what they can say and what they will say, which I think actually, particularly for the time, I think is really important. And rereading it from that point of view, especially, I think is really, in fact, I was on a retreat this past week with the Playwrights realm, and we, had a late night, as playwrights do, 2 a.m. talk about Wendy Wasserstein. And I think her being, one of the, most represented, or only, really represented female playwrights of that time, among like two others, Marcia Norman, I think Beth Henley had like one really well-known play at that time. But I think having women be defined by, what they will say outright, what they will stand behind, is very necessary and very groundbreaking at that time. And what I think really separates Wendy from things like Sex and the City is some of the, like, even what I found so interesting too is that there is like a moment when there is, that scene when like one of Heidi's friends has become like a television producer. Yeah. And she's like, well, we need you to write for this thing. It can be, New York, Houston, whatever. And it's about like women and how they, can't actually have it all, how they regret their choices. And she won't do that. And that was, you know, several what Sex and the City premiere, like
98, I think.
Yeah, so it's at least, this came out in, it was like 10 years before Sex and the City. And Heidi, who is like, you know, very much in many ways known as a stand-in for Wendy Wasserstein, will not do that, and doesn't, she's like, I don't believe that that we have made bad choices. And, you know, I think that's very different from, you know, the sort of male created Sex in the City. Like, there are female writers in that room, but you know, I think that's a much more hopeful point of view. Whether or not, like, I don't know, I struggled with the idea of, like, you know, a lot of people say that this doesn't hold up, but like, what does holding up really mean? And I think, you know, it's more, it's almost like a history play in a lot of ways, because it is about the events that people are going through. Like, the nuance of characters very different than I think what I am most drawn to make. But I think it's like, you know, authentic in a lot of ways that I think things that have kind of emulated that style, to me, don't feel necessarily like they're commenting on women. They're not really coming from a place of personal truth, which it does ring true to me, even though it very, very much represents like a very small, you know, very white, very, you know, kind of capitalist and you know, view of feminism. But I do think that it's like in a very important play in a lot of ways. And like, you know, I think her view is sort of like that she almost might want us to criticize it or grow from it, because it's like, that's what I think is so cool, is that her point of view is like that her 10 is like hope for the future of, you know, daughters being born at the end of the play. And so like what I will always just love about her, even when like, even reading it in 2003, like I don't think there's a lot of things that don't, for me, like the style and the use of like the theatrical isn't what inspired me about it. Is like, it was very, I was like, well, what I want to make is different in that sense. But, you know, I think I'll always connect with like her actual like love and excitement for the future, and I, which I think is absent from a lot of things that like have sort of been, you know, defined as being like very, you know,
Wasserstein-esque.
Yeah.
You brought up so many things I was going to bring up. I definitely think of the Heidi Chronicles as a history play, and I think it's even in the name, which has been parodied over and over again. But first of all, I want to bring you back. You said you first read the play in 2003. Were you just like reading it for fun, or because someone in school was like, you want to be a playwright, you want to write about women, you should read this? And what was your first reaction to it?
No one has ever assigned it to me.
No one ever assigned it to me either, which I think is, you know, says something about the way Wasserstein, I think, is thought of in more academic circles, which I'm sure we can get into, but no one assigned it to you. So did you just pick it up by chance? How did it happen?
I wonder how. I think it might have been my mom who recommended it to me. I first read Uncommon Women and Others, but mostly I don't think I had really read or seen a lot of work that had mostly female characters. And I was told, honestly, like even a little even later in my playwriting career than I think is in any way like excusable or is ever excusable. But like I had been told by different teachers, like, it's good to have a man on the, because that was what I knew. I was raised by a single mom. I, you know, most of my world and was female identified people. And that was always what just naturally I wanted to put in a play. And a lot of the time, like, I grew up acting and in a sort of original play, but like, I don't know, none of the reasons why I got into that was like, really in anything that I had read or seen. And when I read, in fact, it's like a whole collection. I'm sure many people have this. I just was like, oh, wow, there are like ladies saying things, and it's like the center of the play. And that just made me excited as like, an actor, writer, for what I could make and say and that sort of thing, but truly was never, I think I found it at the Strand. It was never assigned. I read like Miller and Williams in high school and stuff like that.
I think people do forget how kind of revolutionary it was at the time, that there just weren't plays or shows that focused on women and their relationships with each other. Wasserstein has been quoted in interviews describing her work as political acts. Do you think of her plays as political? Do you think of the Heidi Chronicles as political? What do you think?
It's interesting because it, in so many ways, because like the history is almost like its own character, which is like, weirdly like what I feel like people always say about Sex and the City is they're like, New York is a character.
Yes.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Like what I think is a political act is like a play not ending with a marriage. A play not ending with like a kiss, whether or not it like feels political in the same ways now. I do think that it is.
Yeah, no, I agree. And you mentioned earlier not being drawn to the form necessarily, which you and I have talked about. I think a reason it doesn't get assigned in the same way that like Carol Churchill, for example, gets assigned is because Heidi Chronicles, I think, sort of has a reputation for being sort of pop arty. Like it seems very conventional in the way that it approaches the dramatic logic or the structure of the play. Do you think of it as conventional in that way? Do you think that's a reason why it gets sort of dismissed today?
Because when rereading it, I kind of went in with that question. I think it just didn't appeal to me and what I want to make, but I think it very much I think the form fits what she does very well, because even in, I love that scene where the like talking circle, because there are very rare moments where like the characters are what they say, which is not what I make at all. Like, I think I write character where like they don't have like actual vocabulary for what they want to say. They don't have an understanding of what's happened to, where one time where Heidi tries to sort of not speak about like in the circle, like I don't, and her friend kind of, brings out like she's with this guy and that she knows that that he's horrible and against like her politics, her, point of view, and she's still seeing him. And that she admits that like, yeah, no, I know he's awful. I would tell any friend not to be involved with this guy. He's absolutely awful, in these ways. He's charismatic, he's this, and I'm still doing it. And I think, like as flat as we want to say like the structure is, like it does actually leave room for that ambiguity for like an imperfect feminist. I do actually think it has those gray areas more than other TV or plays of that I do sort of feel like dulls sometimes the complexity of a character.
I'm really glad you brought up that scene because it's one of my favorite scenes in the play. And I, of course, it was revolutionary just by virtue of the fact that it focused on women and their relationships with each other. But the men do play big roles, and Heidi's relationship to them, specifically Scoop and Peter. What do you think? What's your take on the men quotient in the Heidi Chronicles?
That first scene with Scoop, I'm always so annoyed by. Well, just because it's, you sort of want her to be this, and it's sort of where like I would like to know more about Heidi, that I think, later you get a little bit, but that, for me, like I want to know more about what pulls her in, what her point of view is before she kind of gets pulled in.
Yeah.
Throughout it, I'm like, leave. But like what I think is important about the play too is that it explores the fact that like many very like strong, knowledgeable, feminist women, have dated this guy,
Yes.
or have like been talked over by this guy, or have like, made more space for this guy than themselves. Like that's very important and relatable to like, discuss, but it happens so early in the play that she sort of gets lost in him.
Right.
And I'm interested in like the desire for that and then the rejection of that. But yeah, he does take up a lot of space. And I think, it sort of requires, deciding that he's a jerk before she does, I guess, to sort of find the humor of that scene in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But to me, like Scoop is like he's so unhappy at the end, and I feel like he just represents like what in so many ways like women of that church are like, wanting what he can have, but then it's like what he can have isn't fulfilling either in all these ways.
I think that's true. I think it's like, ooh, there's a mosquito in my apartment.
Yeah, there was one that came across the thing. Maybe it flew from 24th up to.
Probably. We live very close to each other. Yeah, it is like weirdly cathartic that he's so unhappy at the end, I think, because we as an audience member or reader have sort of quietly hated him and wanted Heidi to reach a point where she hates him too, or not hates him, but can extricate herself or distance herself from him. But it's funny that you brought up Sex and the City, which I think is something I know you have thought a lot about when you make your work, but is a very obvious comparison when you're reading Heidi Chronicles, especially if you watch Sex and the City first, because the Heidi Scoop Lisa relationship feels very much like Carrie, Natasha, Big, even in the way that Heidi talks about Lisa. She describes her as blandish, and it's the same way Carrie describes Natasha, that these like powerful men who've achieved great heights in this capitalist society, that they pretend that they want the amazing feminist high achieving woman, but they actually want the sort of bland milquetoast version of that. I definitely think of the play, so much of the play is about envy. That's why I think it's cool, like those complicated relationships with women. You think it's going to be all rah female friendship, but so much of it is like, why can't I have what she has? Do you think that that's something Wasserstein set out to do? Do you think of it as about like envy and competition between women? It seems like you have a more optimistic take.
Maybe it's because of like what stories I made, many people that I knew that had been in readings with her, or that had worked with her, I made them tell me about her when I was like, because it was honestly like I think one of the first plays I had read that had all women in it, and that's what I wanted to see on stage. And so yeah, I think that like I likely very idealized version of this person that I never had the pleasure of meeting is leaving room for the next generation to tear it all down. But yeah, what to me, especially just because I think even in Sex and the City, because it's like I don't really relate to any of the things that those women want. And in some ways, maybe I do in Heidi Chronicles, but I think that like, to me, the unhappiness that it leaves is that like, we're defining sort of like the betterment of women, the like, as, being the CEO of XYZ of,
Right.
it's not a lasting change. And it is just it's very like individually focused on, like, and it puts so much onus on like this woman who achieved XYZ to like encompass everybody's achievement and needs. And then it just inherently becomes, competition. Like, I think most of the people in this play don't feel they've achieved, what the like sort of larger ideal of what they set out to achieve, because I think humans are much more complicated than that. And, and it's not really making space for real change in a systemic way. There's no mention of race at all within the play. And I think for feminism to really be something that, breaks the system and makes room for more, like it has to encompass more than these things, so I do think, but I do still think that the play is optimistic because it's like a beginning, not an ending. Like, I think I wouldn't trust a play either that like was like, and then everything was, fixed forever, which,
Right.
is very much, I think, what, it's so funny that there's like the name of his magazine is Boomer, because that's such a like, derogatory term now.
Yeah.
But I think the stereotype of that is like the idea that like, well, like we fixed everything, just be happy with like, which is not the case on so many levels. And I think I still do sense that the play doesn't end saying like, we've solved everything for you. It leaves room for us to, burn everything down.
Most people who are watching this probably know that it ends with her adopting this baby. And I definitely think of that. You were talking about achievement and how sort of at the start of the play, it's a type of feminism that's like, okay, you can achieve whatever you want to achieve. You can be CEO, you can be the head of this, you can start a magazine, you can be a professor, whatever. And then at the end, it leaves room for wanting different things potentially. Like maybe feminism isn't quite that. But we should mention, people call the Heidi Chronicles a feminist piece, and I think it is, and important for feminism, but it's obviously not intersectional feminism. But I have a lot of trouble with that because I think something that drew me to the Heidi Chronicles specifically is that it is really specific, and I happen to fall into that like cross section of who can identify it. I'm from New York, I'm Jewish, and I'm female identifying. And so for me, that's seeing myself on stage, but then you can't help but think, oh, a huge section of the population that has never heard of the ERBs or the Ethical Culture School or Florine Stettheimer is going to be completely alienated by this play. So the question then becomes like, how valuable is it? My view is sort of, we have to continue reading it, especially as women, but with that grain of salt, knowing that there's so much work to be done. And as you say, not a single mention of race or sort of the gender binary or anything. Or do you think we throw it out entirely and say like, it wasn't good enough and we have to create new work that is good enough?
Like, think of all of the plays that are assigned in, even high school through, like, there are so many, there's so much that's absent in the works that we make people read as canon and as like held up as like this is a play that defines this whole generation. And so I don't think throwing it out is really, I think that the play seems to leave room for that, is like, investigate this, like, criticize it and think that, and that's partially the point. Like, you know, theater isn't like an iPhone, you know, it's not meant to just be like user friendly and all. It's not meant to be, I mean, not that like, I don't know, iPhones are meant to break like as soon as the next one comes out. It's like, but like plays aren't meant to be like a sort of capitalist enterprise in that way. It's like, it's a living, breathing thing. And I think part of reading them and reviving them is to say like, wow, well, there's this absent. And it did that. Honestly, I read her plays feeling what was absent for me, and then being very excited to make that.
That speaks so well to the play, that it's the kind of play that you can look at and recognize there's some blind spots, but instead of going away and be like, I hate this, it's more like, it's inspiring. It clearly inspired you to go out and think about what kind of work you want to make. You mentioned earlier that you're very interested in what goes sort of unsaid with female characters. And that was very interesting to me, because when I reread the play, I hadn't reread it in a while, I felt like there was a theme I hadn't noticed before, which was this discussion of worth, like self-worth and everyone's worth. The word just keeps coming up. And Heidi's last wish for her daughter in the last scene is that she never feel worthless. And I thought that was really interesting, because we definitely see various characters, and especially Heidi, in low points. And we know that she says like, I've made mistakes, or I feel dissatisfied, or whatever, but I don't think there's a moment where we really see like true worthlessness. I think it's sort of like, or a true feeling of worthlessness on Heidi's part. I feel like it's sort of left off stage, left to the audience's imagination, maybe in that monologue she has where she talks about like going to the gym and sort of her breakdown at the gym. But I'm curious, do you think that's purposefully left out of the narrative? And had you ever thought about this like question of worth when you were thinking about the play?
It's interesting, because even with her, when she says several times in the play that she's unhappy, it's also not something that I feel like I experience emotionally from the character, or that I see displayed in so many ways. So, and you know, like I think so much of like what interests me about what is unsaid, or what can't, is sort of about like what narratives, what stories, what are we, you know, canonizing, what have we seen, because I think that's a large part of, I mean, narrative is like such a big part about how we find who we can be, what we listen to about our own impulses. And I think like I because reading it, obviously, you know, many years after it was written, I'm someone who's grown up with like archetypes of women that like Wendy Wasserstein is you know, responsible for creating in so many ways. And I think like so much of the or the unhappiness, the worthlessness is like coming from a place of like, I don't know what this looks like. I don't, they're sort of uncharted territory, which I don't relate to. And I think the same way as a woman seeing this play in 1988 might. And that's why in some ways, like what feels dated sometimes about is just that I think, you know, we're coming into the theater, like we're coming into this play knowing, you know, so much about the women of this, because they've, you know, created so much for us.
I think you're right. And it brings us back to our discussion of like Heidi Chronicles as a history play, because as a director too, I was reading the play and thinking about like, is there ever a version of this play that you could take out of its time? And I don't think that there is, because I mean, I hate to use your own phrasing that it's like history is the, fourth character or whatever, but I do think that that's true. And it is the context that makes things said or unsaid. It's defines all of the characters and their relationships to one another, and defines their wants and objectives, and you sort of can't get away with that. And I think I loved hearing what you said about how like it's still very character driven and like about their relationships with each other, because I think that can sometimes get lost in the feeling of the play as like, okay, we're in the 60s and then we're in the 70s and then we're in the 80s and then we're in the 90s, sort of like a Forrest Gumpian, like putting characters in these places to like teach us about the history. And I think that's a mistake. I think that's like a bad reading of the play, but I could see how people read it that way sometimes.
Have you ever seen it performed?
No, I never have, actually.
I know it's interesting to see, because it's even when it was performed, it already was sort of a period piece. So that's like sort of in many ways intentional. Like even it's like a future play, and because it was done in 88, and the there's in 89,
like 90s, right?
Yeah, like I think her daughter is born in 89.
We've talked about the specificity, and we've talked about how I think Wasserstein, Heidi, most people view Heidi as like a map for Wasserstein herself, which I think can get into thorny territory, but fine. I also think it's such a Jewish play, and as someone who is Jewish too, what do you make of that? But it's Jewish, but not in a very like specific secular New York kind of way. Is that an important aspect of it to you, or does that feel secondary?
It seems sort of just interwoven into like what I really do love about Wendy's work is that she really writes from, what she knows and who she is in so many ways. So I think that's, like it just seems very interwoven. What's interesting though is like it's like you said, like very New York Jew, like that it's never something that's really challenged or criticized within the world. Like it's very maybe not secondary, maybe that's not the word exactly, but it is in a sense secondary, that it's not put on trial in any way, that it's not dangerous, that it's not like kind of center stage in the way that being Jewish might be in plays, in other plays.
In other parts of the world and other times. I think that's really right, because when obviously Jews have basically made the theater industry in many respects, but in terms of like being represented on stage, not very often. And I feel like when it is, it's like, Fiddler on the Roof, or like indecent, very, very specific sort of Jews are in danger, more religious. But the only sort of equivalent I can think of is Falsettos. Are you familiar with that musical?
No, not really. I don't think.
They have like, it's not at all about being Jewish, but they're in New York. They happen to be Jewish, and there's like a bar mitzvah where a lot of stuff happens. And I think of it as being similar to the Heidi Chronicles, as you say, because it's just like, it seems to be another way that she's making the place feel specific and feel like the culture that she knows, and writing what she knows, in the same way that the music is specific to the time, and the same way that Heidi works in art history, and that's specific to the time. What do you think about that framing piece? Do you think that the choice to make Heidi an art historian is deliberate and interesting?
Because it's just right where we start, and there were so many. I think I don't know if it necessarily requires you to understand all of the references that she makes. What I find most interesting about it actually is that that part of the scene is seeing these paintings, and even the choice that I might make, is like, the sort of the painting being in the audience, like, her describing something that we can't see. And that's what interests me about it, is that like the sort of literal quality of that, like, and like maybe that in some ways form what we say, feels very poppy, that it could also exist in a film in a different way. But I do think there's something interesting about, I like, again, like I said, it's something that I like to make things in the audience, because it's like you're more nobody, if like the tech person, or if like the is, or if accidentally it's like a picture of Scooby-Doo or something, then like, and it makes like an audience have to imagine something. But like, I think what's interesting about it is that she sort of requires us to look at it. And I think it's also very clear that like who these women are, who these painters are, is important to Heidi and to Wendy.
I think you're right that it operates on two levels, that it's like, it does say something about Heidi that she is focusing on female painters and artists because they hadn't been focused on in the same way. I think one of my best friends is an art historian, and we often talk about how theater and art history are actually very similar, in that like no one was talking about women in art until kind of the 70s. And so I think that connection is like deliberate on Wasserstein's part, but I also think you're totally right that it can be as simple as technical, like we're still doing a play. It's not just like something to read. And I think you're right that there's something, not only are you making the audience imagine, but you're making them look at Heidi, look at something, which I think is really interesting. The like triple gaze there is something to account for. That was my biggest question when reading the play. I kept being like, why does she frame it with these lectures?
For me, my question is always, why is that first? Like, why is that how we meet Heidi? I guess, in a way, meeting her through her telling us about other people, like on the very base level.
That brings me to some of my last questions, which is, what are some questions you're left with when reading or seeing the play?
I always want to know more about Heidi. And what her unhappiness is about. Like we don't get a lot of, whereas I think most of the characters really like state what they want. A lot. What she wants seems almost more ethereal, like more, in larger ideas, rather than like, I want to be the head of XYZ, like I want to run this, I want to be the first woman to do this, like, and I'm always left with like, what is her inner life, which is in a way, like, I think what the play inspires me to, like, in so many ways to write, is like, how do you represent that on stage?
No, I think you're right that Heidi is like, even though we love her and she's funny and she's smart and we identify with her and empathize with her, she is sort of like a cipher figure for these larger political feminist ideas that Wasserstein was trying to convey, which is amazing and paved the way for so much. But you're right that we don't, and as I said, we don't get the moments where she's feeling worthless or unhappy. She sort of says it, but we don't really like have a reference point for it. And that leaves us wanting more. I think you're right about that.
And then it's in that, like, it makes me think about how, like, because I always think in that last scene is like, Scoop is unhappy. You know, he didn't go for his 10. She went for her 10, but still her, and then she of course criticizes him, like, so my 10 is a baby and yours is like running the universe. And not a direct quote, but I think it is interesting that, like, her pursuit of feeling, you know, like she's worth something, feeling happy, is again to like give to another person, which is, I think, a lot of the time what we say about boomers is that they are raised to sort of have to feel as if that their actions have a purpose for something bigger than themselves.
Yeah.
And I guess that's almost what's what makes it sort of like, and it's not an incomplete play, but it's like a beginning to me, is like, I think what I want is to see, like, you know, these characters actually like go inward and like, and think about who they are and what makes them happy, because her sort of pursuit of that is to like give to the next generation and raise the next generation, which I don't know, like, I'm curious, like 10 years later, or like 20 years, when her daughter is like going off to Holyoke. Well, that's not where Heidi went to Vassar, right? And Wendy went to Holyoke. But yeah, I like kind of wonder where that is, which some people say, I think that Gina John Frieda wrote that play, Blister, Rapture, Burn.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I don't think like intentionally, but they did an article about how she like sort of, you know, wrote the continuation of the Heidi Chronicles, also done at Playwrights Horizons.
Also, I think we've been throwing around a term that is used a lot in the play, which is like going for your 10, meaning achieving the highest thing that you want to achieve in life. And I think, or the most happy that you could be in life, even though at the end of the play, Heidi's sort of acknowledging that, like, okay, she went for her 10 initially and now she's going for her 10 in this other way, and Scoop doesn't have his 10. It seems like what you're saying is you want them to sort of smash that concept of like, we got to go for the 10 all the time.
Yeah, well, because it's inherently like a ranking system, like, you know, like, yeah, and it's not an inclusive model at all. Like, it's just puts us in a new competition, and it doesn't actually interrogate the system that like truly could make a space for, you know, all women, all, you know, genders to have access to like the basic needs. Because it's like, when we start from a place of like, your basic needs are met, you know, housing, food, which, you know, it are feminist issues that are not,
Yeah,
you know, often included. When those things are met, then like people have the opportunity to achieve like what their 10 is in a different way, like, you know, maybe not defined that way, but it's, you know, I think a 10, or the way that like Scoop talks about grading systems, is like inherently it requires somebody else's judgment to approve. Like, when you're given a grade, it's somebody else like taking in the work that you've done, and like grading, you know, what you've done, and said like, I believe like you have this grade. And like I think what these characters like deserve, or the next generation deserve, is like, well, like, how do I feel when there's no grading system, or when I'm evaluating myself and my life and my happiness, and what do I want, rather than it being sort of characterized by this larger system that leaves them unhappy, you know?
I think it comes back to this question of like worth and self-worth, which I see as the major like driving force in Heidi and in the play, which you can only get from yourself, right? It's not, obviously it's connected to society, but it's different than the 10 or the grading system. It's just like, how do I feel about myself internally, which I think is sort of a beautiful wish that Heidi has for her daughter at the end. My last question, you've sort of answered this, but are there ways that you've either talked about or haven't talked about that the Heidi Chronicles inspires you and your work as a playwright?
I think in many ways that I've been writing now long enough that like I can't even see them in the same way that I would have like in 2003. But I think a lot of it, like just even, which even the just existence of them, of a play that's where there isn't a male character, which is not the Heidi Chronicles, but I think is Uncommon Women, or maybe there's like one or two men. But I think just even the existence of that was like an absolute like foundation and platform for what kind of things I mean. And still even like, I think until fairly recently, was it something that I feel like bringing in, or maybe I'm just in the spaces that, like the Playwrights are like these, the company that I keep now is definitely, it's not a question that like, yeah, there's this play is all female identified characters, is not like the first thing that somebody says about my play, or it's not said, it's just, it's accepted. And which was not my experience when I first started, even in college, it just was like always a note of like, but what if, don't you need, like, because I think so much about like what you perpetuate is like what you give space and stage time to. And I think to me that was really important.
When do you feel like that changed, that people stopped sort of giving you notes that were like, what if there was a male character?
The wolves and like that sort of when a play like with all, and I love that play, and I still find it so like, I find it so funny and irritating that that's like what was so like, oh wow, like that it's all women, but that's what's so surprising. Like there's so much that's more beautiful and interesting about that play than purely the fact that it's all women on stage, like the subtle changes. There's just so much more about that, but that I think was like sort of a shift in a lot of ways.
That's so recent. That's so recent.
Yeah.
Wow.
Like I've literally had someone say like, but I mean, it's always good though to have a man on stage. Like absolutely, it was, I think, like 2006 or something. It was like a summer class I took, and like that, I do not believe that person who still like would say that now, but they absolutely said that to me, in a playwriting class.
Wow.
And it's so much about what I think like these plays were trying to do, of just make that a laughable statement, that, and I think that's what Heidi sort of sets out to, or hopes to have happen in the future. And we were not at that future yet, but
yeah. Well, it goes to show that it's still, I really do believe, obviously I'm doing a whole episode on it, and I think it has problems, as we've discussed throughout this interview, that you have to go in knowing, you can't be blind to them. But I think it would be, especially given the fact that people are still amazed that there can be all female casts and all female creative teams, and just focusing on female driven stories, that the play is necessary and needs to be read and performed. Well, this was so amazing, Maya. Thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. I feel like I have a better understanding of the play thanks to you. Do you want to tell us, just to end, anything that you're working on currently that you want people to know about?
working on a sort of extended version of my play 3 Anne Franks that is literally called 3.5 Anne Franks. It's a full-length version of this play. And I think that there's one male character in it now, which was not the case. And I do think, yeah, it's, but it's, other than that, it's about 3.5, no, it's about 4
The half is the man
actors auditioning for, well, they're auditioning for a male director potentially. I might cut him and have him be off stage. We don't know yet. He is off stage in the short version that I've written. But you know, like what it's more about these actors and, you know, why they're so sort of, why they feel that they can retell the story of this girl, and how, you know, the sort of perception of who Anne Frank was perpetuated by, you know, anti-Semitic forces, you know, sort of a lot of male forces. And also even me, like when I went in to write the play, I was like, I'm going to tell the real Anne Frank. She was like a secret bisexual, and like all her dad like cut all that stuff out of it. And I was like, no, that's like what I need her to be, or what I get from her, like, and what comfort I bring from connecting to her. So it's sort of about how we retell history, and how it's inevitably more about who we are.
Very Wasserstein-esque in so many Wasserstein.
Yeah.
I can't wait to read it and hear about it. Maybe we'll be doing an episode on that in a year or so. Can't wait. Thank you so much. This was the best. I could talk to you for hours, but we have limited time, and thank you so much. That was such a wonderful interview with Maya, and it's so invigorating and exciting to hear that Wendy Wasserstein's work continues to influence the next generation of female playwrights, even though, as we've discussed, we should continue to look at them through a discriminating and even a critical lens, because there are some real problems with it. But I think, as Maya and I discussed, as long as we approach these plays with a grain of salt, that's saying, how are they dated? What groups of people do they fail? What can we say about them now? How can we perhaps approach them from a more intersectional place? We can still learn from them, and they're still highly, highly valuable. And I feel like even from this conversation with Maya, I learned things about the play that I had still been working through, including the ways that capitalism fails intersectional feminism, and the ways that Heidi and her friends' very specific failures and goals can be connected to that economic framework, which deliberately excludes lower income people and people of color. My understanding of the importance of art history in the play, and what that could be saying about what Heidi likes and her very specific brand of feminism. And my framing of the ending as a true beginning, which I had never really thought about. And I especially liked the elements of optimism and hope that Maya brought to her, that Maya's reading of the play brought. But I want to end by emphasizing again some of the reasons I'm specifically drawn to the play. I mentioned that my academic work has focused on relationships between women, and I figured I'd specify. I wrote my senior thesis in college about female, male love triangles in Jane Austen novels. And instead of talking about how it's about the desire of these two women for the man, the object in question, I wrote about how it's really more about the women and their perceptions of and relationship with each other. I really wanted to focus on that special mixture of competition, admiration, and attraction, not necessarily sexual attraction, although sometimes it can be, that is unique, in my opinion, to relationships between women. When I'm thinking about that, I think of a specific line in the Heidi Chronicles where she's complaining about dating and, you know, her sense of self. And she says, you know, I envy women I don't even know. And I've discussed that with other friends of mine, and I think it's so true, and sort of an ugly truth about being a woman that we don't often acknowledge. Even in the past, when people were starting to represent women, as I mentioned before, they were sort of like always hunky-dory girl power relationships, and they can be much thornier and much more complicated. And that's why I'm drawn to them. That's why I love them. And I definitely think that had not really been represented on stage before the play The Heidi Chronicles, which, as we saw from Maya's college professor, dared to have scenes where there wasn't a single male character and was only primarily focused on the ways that women relate to one another. Finally, I want to address the question of self-worth, to which I've continued to return in this discussion. It really struck me when I was rereading the play in preparation for this episode of how much worth and self-worth was mentioned. I think it was mentioned over 10 times in the text. And when I thought about it, I thought it was a perfect distillation of what a culture of sort of casual misogyny does to a woman. I mean, luckily, we no longer live in a society that is completely oppressive to women. We have the right to vote, we can own property, we can make medical choices about our own bodies. But I believe we are still very much so living in a culture where young women and middle-aged women and old women are inundated with subliminal messages about our own self-worth. That is to say, women are told by the culture we consume, the schools we attend, and the men we interact with, some of whom may even be the men that love us, that we are worthless, that we have no worth in the eyes of society. And I think the true journey and the power of the Heidi Chronicles is the history, there's that word again, I really do believe it's a history play, of how one woman was ultimately able to achieve self-worth in a culture that denies it, and achieve self-worth on her own terms by looking inward and thinking about what she considers worthwhile and what she thinks will actually make her happy. And I think that's, to use more of the terminology from the play, the perfect 10 that we can all hope for. So I very much hope you enjoyed this episode. I feel like we sort of ended on a sad note about misogyny, but I think it's really important to remember. And as Maya said, the play does end on a note of optimism, with hope for the future, with Heidi and her daughter. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. As with all of my special episodes, it's very emotional to me. It's plays and pieces that I love, but I always want to hear more about what you're hoping that I focus on next. So maybe put some suggestions in the comments, anything you want me to discuss. And there won't be another call time next week, but following that, we'll be back to a rotation with interviews with theater's best and brightest. Thanks for watching.